Sometimes the most unexpected heroes emerge from the most ordinary moments. In the dusty streets of a small Texas town, where everyone knew everyone's business, a desperate cry from a 12-year-old girl would shatter the silence of a Tuesday afternoon. What happened next would prove that kindness isn't measured by size, wealth, or status, but by the courage to stand up when others fall silent. This is the true story of how one man's simple act of decency rippled through an entire community, exposing hidden truths, challenging long-held prejudices, and ultimately saving more than just one sick mother's life. It's about the power of human connection in a world that often feels divided, and how sometimes the biggest hearts come in the most surprising packages. Get ready to witness how a single moment of compassion can change everything and everyone it touches. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement of Main Street as 12-year-old Maria Gonzalez clutched her mother's medication bottle with trembling hands. The white plastic container felt impossibly heavy in her small palm, containing pills that cost more than her family spent on groceries in a month. She had walked the same route for 3 weeks now, going door to door in their small town of Cedar Falls, population 8,000, hoping anyone would help her save her mother's life. Elena Gonzalez had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition 6 months earlier. The medical bills had drained their savings faster than water in the desert. Maria's father, Roberto, worked double shifts at the local meat processing plant, but his wages barely covered rent and basic necessities. The specialized medication Elena needed cost $800 every 2 weeks, and their insurance had denied coverage, calling it experimental treatment. Maria had watched her mother grow weaker each day. Elena, once vibrant and full of laughter, now spent most hours in bed, her olive skin pale and drawn, her breathing labored. The sparkle in her dark eyes had dimmed to barely a flicker. Roberto tried to hide his desperation from his daughter, but Maria saw him crying in the kitchen late at night, bills scattered across the table like fallen leaves. That's when Maria made her decision. She would save her mother herself. The first house she approached belonged to Mrs. Perfecto Henderson, an elderly woman who lived in the nicest part of town. Maria had knocked on the pristine white door, her heart pounding as she explained her mother's situation. Mrs. Henderson listened with what seemed like sympathy, nodding at appropriate moments, but when Maria finished her plea, the woman's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, dear, but we can't help people who don't help themselves," Mrs. Henderson had said, glancing meaningfully at Maria's worn clothing and scuffed shoes. "Perhaps your parents should have thought about medical insurance before they had children." The door closed with a definitive click, leaving Maria standing alone on the perfectly manicured lawn. House after house, the story repeated itself. Some people were kinder in their rejections, offering words of sympathy but no concrete help. Others were blunt, suggesting the family apply for government assistance or move somewhere with better medical facilities. One man actually accused Maria of running a scam, threatening to call the police if she didn't leave his property immediately. By the third week, Maria's small notebook contained the addresses of over 200 homes. She had been turned away from every single one. Her feet ached from walking miles each day. Her voice had grown hoarse from repeating her mother's story, and her heart felt heavier than she thought possible for someone her age. But she refused to give up. The town of Cedar Falls had always been divided, though most people preferred not to acknowledge it openly. The north side housed families like the Hendersons, Carmichaels, and Washingtons, longtime residents whose ancestors had founded the town over a century ago. Their houses were large and well-maintained, their lawns green despite the drought, their children attending private schools in nearby Dallas. The south side told a different story. Here lived the families who worked in the factories, cleaned the big houses, and kept the town running behind the scenes. The Gonzalez family rented a small 2-bedroom house with faded yellow paint and a front yard more dirt than grass. The air conditioning unit wheezed and struggled against the heat, and sometimes the electricity went out when too many appliances ran at once. Maria had always been aware of this division, but it had never felt as stark as it did during her 3 weeks of door-knocking. The invisible line between North and South Cedar Falls might as well have been a brick wall topped with razor wire. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Maria found herself in a part of town she had never visited before. These weren't the mansion-like homes of the north side, but they weren't the cramped houses of the south either. The properties here were sprawling, with vast open spaces and modest but well-built homes. This was ranch country, where families had raised cattle and horses for generations. She had heard whispers about the man who lived at the end of Oakwood Road. People called him Giant Johnson, though his real name was Marcus. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds, he certainly earned his nickname through sheer physical presence. But the whispers weren't just about his size. They were about his temperament. Marcus Johnson had moved to Cedar Falls 5 years ago, purchasing the old Whitman Ranch after the family went bankrupt.
He kept to himself mostly, raising cattle and a few horses, occasionally seen in town buying supplies or grabbing lunch at the local diner. He was polite but distant, never engaging in the small talk that was the lifeblood of small-town social interaction. The rumors started because people feared what they didn't understand. Marcus's size made him intimidating, and his preference for solitude made him mysterious. Some claimed he had a violent past. Others whispered about why a man his age remained unmarried and childless. The fact that he was one of the few black residents in a predominantly white town added another layer of complexity to the gossip mill.
Maria had hesitated before walking down Oakwood Road. She had heard the stories, seen the way people's voices dropped when they mentioned Giant Johnson. But desperation had a way of making fear seem insignificant. Her mother was running out of time, and Maria was running out of options. The ranch stretched out before her like something from a movie. Rolling hills dotted with cattle extended as far as she could see. The house itself was surprisingly modest, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch and well-maintained but simple landscaping. A few horses grazed peacefully in a nearby paddock, their tails swishing lazily in the afternoon breeze. As Maria approached the front door, her legs felt unsteady. She had grown accustomed to rejection, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion finally catching up with her, or maybe it was the crushing weight of 3 weeks' worth of disappointment. Whatever it was, she felt tears building behind her eyes as she raised her small fist to knock. The sound echoed across the porch, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the trees. Maria was about to knock again when she heard heavy footsteps approaching from inside the house. The door opened, and Maria had to crane her neck back to see Marcus Johnson's face. He was exactly as large as the rumor suggested, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorframe, and hands that looked like they could palm a basketball with ease. His skin was dark and weathered from years of working outdoors, and his hair was cut short and neat. But it was his eyes that surprised Maria most. They were gentle, curious, rather than intimidating. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice deep but surprisingly soft. He looked down at the small girl on his porch with obvious concern, taking in her tired expression and the medication bottle clutched in her hands. Maria had rehearsed her speech so many times that the words usually came automatically. But standing before this giant of a man, she found herself struggling to speak. The weight of 3 weeks of rejection, the fear for her mother's life, and the sheer exhaustion of carrying such a heavy burden finally overwhelmed her. "They want to hurt my mom. She's sick," she cried, the words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held up the medication bottle with shaking hands. "Nobody will help us. Nobody cares that she's dying." Marcus Johnson stood frozen in his doorway, looking down at this sobbing child who had appeared on his ranch like something from a dream. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about his place in this town, about the invisible barriers that separated people from one another, began to shift. This wasn't just another day on the ranch. This was the beginning of something that would change not only Maria and her family, but Marcus himself, and ultimately, the entire town of Cedar Falls. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest human response to suffering, the decision to care when everyone else has chosen to look away. Marcus knelt down slowly, bringing his massive frame closer to Maria's eye level, and for the first time in weeks, the little girl felt like someone was actually seeing her, not just listening to her words but understanding the desperation behind them. "Tell me about your mom," he said quietly, and something in his voice told Maria that this conversation would be different from all the others. This time, someone was finally ready to listen with their heart, not just their ears. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the Texas landscape, but on the porch of the Johnson Ranch, something cool and healing was beginning to grow in the space between a desperate child and an unlikely hero who was about to discover that sometimes the biggest impact comes from simply choosing to care. Marcus Johnson had lived alone for so long that the sound of genuine distress in his home felt foreign, almost overwhelming. After inviting Maria inside and offering her a glass of cold water, he sat across from her at his kitchen table, listening as she poured out her story. The medication bottle sat between them like a small monument to desperation, its label worn smooth from Maria's constant handling. The kitchen was simple but clean, with handmade wooden furniture and family photographs covering one wall. Maria noticed pictures of Marcus with various groups of people, some in military uniforms, others in casual clothes around barbecue grills and campfires. Despite the rumors about his antisocial nature, the photos suggested someone who had once been deeply connected to others. "My mom used to make the best enchiladas in the whole world," Maria said, her voice still shaky but growing stronger as she spoke. Before she got sick, she would cook huge meals every Sunday, and all our neighbors would come over. She said food was how you showed people you loved them. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks.
Now she can barely get out of bed to eat soup. Marcus found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. It had been months since he'd had a real conversation with anyone, and years since someone had spoken to him without fear or judgment coloring their voice.
This child's pain was so raw, so honest, that it cut through the protective walls he had built around his heart. "What kind of medicine does she need?" he asked, picking up the bottle and reading the label. The name was long and complicated, full of scientific terms he didn't recognize, but the price sticker made his stomach clench. $800 for a 2-week supply was more than many families in Cedar Falls spent on rent. Maria explained her mother's condition as best she could, using words she had learned from doctor visits and insurance phone calls.
Elena's immune system was attacking her own body, causing inflammation that made it difficult to breathe and digest food.
Without the medication, her condition would continue to deteriorate until her organs began to fail.
"The doctor said we caught it early enough that she could get better,"
Maria said, hope flickering in her voice.
"But only if she takes the medicine consistently. We can't afford to miss doses, and we're already 3 days behind." Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. A sense of purpose beyond his daily routines of feeding cattle and mending fences. This little girl had walked for miles in the heat, knocked on hundreds of doors, and faced rejection after rejection, all to save her mother's life. Her determination reminded him of something important about human nature that he had almost forgotten. "Why did you come all the way out here?" he asked gently. "Most folks in town don't even know I exist." Maria looked down at her hands, suddenly embarrassed. "I heard people talking about you at school. They said you were scary and mean, but I thought maybe that meant you weren't like the other adults. Maybe you wouldn't pretend to care and then say no." Her honesty hit Marcus like a physical blow. He realized that his isolation, which he had intended as protection from the judgment and suspicion of others, had inadvertently created a reputation that frightened children. The irony wasn't lost on him, that his attempt to avoid being seen as threatening had made him seem more intimidating than ever. "What if I told you I'd help you get the medicine your mom needs?" Marcus said quietly. "Would you believe me?" Maria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She had heard similar promises before, followed by excuses about needing to check bank accounts or discuss it with spouses. "Do you really mean it?" "I mean it," Marcus said, and something in his voice convinced Maria that this promise was different. "But I want to do more than just buy medicine. I want to understand why a little girl had to walk around begging for help while adults who could afford it turned her away." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus learned more about the hidden struggles of Cedar Falls than he had discovered in 5 years of living there. Maria told him about families who chose between electricity and groceries, children who wore the same clothes to school every day because their parents couldn't afford new ones, and elderly residents who rationed their heart medication to make it last longer. She also told him about the invisible barriers that divided the town. How kids from the south side weren't invited to birthday parties on the north side. How job opportunities seemed to go to certain families while others remained stuck in cycles of low-paying work. How the town council made decisions about infrastructure improvements that somehow always benefited the wealthier neighborhoods first. "It's like there are 2 different towns," Maria said, "and people pretend they don't see the line down the middle." Marcus had sensed these divisions during his time in Cedar Falls, but he had assumed they were simply the natural result of economic differences. He hadn't realized how deliberate and entrenched the separation had become. His own isolation had protected him from the worst of it, but it had also blinded him to the suffering happening just miles from his ranch. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and force. He would not only help Maria's family but find a way to address the larger problems that had created their crisis. He had spent years avoiding involvement in community affairs, but this child's courage had shown him that standing aside was itself a choice, and not one he was comfortable making anymore. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, his voice taking on a determination that Maria had never heard from an adult before. "Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to the pharmacy to get your mom's medicine. Then we're going to visit your parents and figure out a long-term plan." But that's just the beginning. Maria felt her heart racing with excitement and terror. After weeks of disappointment, success felt almost too good to be true. "What do you mean that's just the beginning?"
Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at his cattle grazing peacefully in the distance.
"I've been thinking about this all wrong," he said. "I moved here because I wanted peace and quiet. Wanted to mind my own business and let everyone else do the same."
But maybe peace isn't something you can have when your neighbors are suffering. He turned back to Maria, his expression serious but kind. "What if we could change how this town works? What if we could make it so no other little girl has to walk around begging for help, while people who could make a difference choose to look the other way?" Maria didn't fully understand what Marcus meant, but she could sense the power in his words. For the first time since her mother's diagnosis, she felt like she had an ally. Someone who wouldn't just offer temporary help, but might actually fight alongside her family for something bigger. That evening, Marcus drove Maria home in his pickup truck, a massive vehicle that suited his size but felt like a spaceship compared to her family's old sedan. As they pulled up to the small yellow house, Maria saw her father's silhouette in the kitchen window. Roberto had probably been pacing with worry, wondering where his daughter had disappeared to for the entire afternoon. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked as Marcus turned off the engine.
"People might not like it if you get involved." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. He knew she was right. His help would likely generate gossip and possibly hostility from some quarters. His size and race had already made him a target for whispered speculation. Adding activism to the mix would certainly make his life more complicated. But as he looked at Maria's hopeful face, then at the modest house where a sick woman lay waiting for medicine her family couldn't afford, Marcus realized that comfort had become a cage. His desire to avoid conflict had prevented him from living fully in the world, from connecting with people who needed connection, from using his resources and privilege to make a difference.
"Let them not like it," he said simply. "Some things are more important than being liked." They walked to the front door together, the giant rancher and the determined little girl who had somehow found the courage to knock on his door and ask for help. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the moment everything in Cedar Falls began to change. Sometimes revolution starts not with grand gestures or public declarations, but with one person deciding to say yes when everyone else has said no. As Marcus raised his hand to knock on the Gonzalez family's door, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the excitement of being part of something larger than himself. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine, but tonight a mother would sleep peacefully knowing her medicine was coming, and a little girl would finally believe that adults could be trusted to keep their promises. The door opened, and Roberto Gonzalez found himself face to face with the giant man his daughter had been telling him about for the past hour. But instead of the intimidating figure he had expected, Roberto saw kindness in Marcus's eyes and hope in his daughter's smile, and he knew that their long nightmare was finally beginning to end. The news of Giant Johnson's involvement with the Gonzalez family spread through Cedar Falls faster than wildfire in drought season. By Thursday morning, just 2 days after Maria's visit to his ranch, Marcus couldn't buy coffee at Miller's Diner without feeling the weight of curious stares and hushed conversations. Some looks held admiration, others suspicion, but all of them carried the electric charge of a community in transition. Elena Gonzalez had taken her first dose of medication Wednesday evening, and the relief on her face had been worth every cent of the $800 Marcus had spent at Westfield Pharmacy. But the pharmacist, Mrs. Chen, had pulled Marcus aside with troubling news. Elena's case wasn't unique. At least 12 other families in Cedar Falls were rationing or completely unable to afford essential medications. The problem was much larger than one sick mother. "I've been filling prescriptions in this town for 15 years, Mrs. Chen had confided, her voice low despite the empty store. "I see people choosing between their heart pills and their diabetes medication. I see parents going without their antidepressants so their kids can have antibiotics. It breaks my heart, but what can I do? I can't give away medicine for free." That conversation had planted a seed in Marcus's mind that was growing into something much more ambitious than he had originally planned. As he sat in his kitchen that Thursday morning, making lists and calculations on a yellow legal pad, he began to envision a solution that could help not just the Gonzalez family, but every family in Cedar Falls struggling with medical costs. The knock on his door came at precisely 9 o'clock. Marcus opened it to find Maria bright-eyed and energetic in a way she hadn't been since her mother's diagnosis. Behind her stood a woman he didn't recognize, tall, elegantly dressed, with graying hair pulled back in a professional bun. "Mr. Johnson," Maria said formally, clearly having practiced her introduction. "This is Ms. Patricia Wells. She's a reporter from the Dallas Morning News, and she wants to write a story about what you did for my family."
Marcus felt his stomach drop. The last thing he wanted was media attention, especially when his plans were still forming in his mind. But Patricia Wells stepped forward with a warm smile and an extended hand.
Mr. Johnson, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Maria called our newsroom yesterday, and frankly, her story was too compelling to ignore. A 12-year-old girl walking door to door for 3 weeks, being turned away by neighbors who could afford to help. Until she finally finds someone willing to listen, that's the kind of story people need to hear.
Marcus invited them in reluctantly, but as Patricia began asking questions about his motivations and plans, he found himself warming to the conversation. She wasn't looking for a simple feel-good story about a good Samaritan. She wanted to understand the systemic issues that had created Maria's crisis in the first place. What I find fascinating, Patricia said, reviewing her notes, is how your arrival seems to have exposed fault lines that were already present in this community.
The economic disparity, the racial dynamics, the way people respond differently to the same request for help depending on who's asking. Marcus had been thinking about exactly that issue.
During his 2 days of research, calling doctors' offices, insurance companies, and social service agencies, he had discovered that resources existed to help families like the Gonzaleses, but the information was scattered and difficult to access. More importantly, the social networks that usually shared such information seemed to operate along the same invisible boundaries that divided the rest of the town.
I think the real story here isn't about me buying medicine, Marcus told Patricia. It's about why a little girl had to become her own advocate because all the systems that should have helped her family had failed. That afternoon, Marcus made his first public appearance in Cedar Falls since moving there 5 years earlier.
He walked into the weekly town council meeting, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room like a storm front moving across the plains. The council members, then terrible enough to go with it, all from the north side of town, looked up with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern.
Marcus had never spoken at a public meeting before, but his military background had taught him how to command attention when necessary. When Council President David Carmichael asked if there was any new business, Marcus stood slowly, his height making him visible, from every corner of the room. "My name is Marcus Johnson, and I'd like to propose a community health fund," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the small auditorium. "I've learned that multiple families in our town are struggling with medical costs that force them to choose between health care and basic necessities. I believe we can do better." The proposal Marcus outlined was comprehensive and surprisingly sophisticated. He had spent hours on the phone with public health experts, nonprofit administrators, and community organizers in other towns. His plan involved creating a fund supported by voluntary contributions from residents and local businesses, administered by a diverse board that included representatives from all parts of town. The fund would provide emergency assistance for prescription medications, medical equipment, and urgent procedures not covered by insurance. More importantly, it would include a navigation service to help families access existing resources they might not know about, everything from federal assistance programs to pharmaceutical company patient aid programs. The goal isn't to replace existing services, Marcus explained, but to fill the gaps and make sure information reaches everyone who needs it. Right now, knowledge about available help seems to flow through some networks but not others. The room was dead silent as Marcus finished speaking. Council President Carmichael cleared his throat nervously, glancing at his colleagues before responding. "Mr. Johnson, we appreciate your, civic interest. But establishing a fund like this would require significant legal and administrative oversight. The liability issues alone." "I've already consulted with attorneys," Marcus interrupted smoothly, pulling a folder from his jacket. "I have preliminary legal opinions on structure and liability, sample bylaws from similar programs in other communities, and letters of intent from potential board members. I'm not asking you to take this on. I'm asking for your endorsement and help with community outreach." The meeting erupted into sidebar conversations as council members huddled together, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected challenge to their usual agenda of road maintenance and zoning permits. Marcus remained standing, patient but unmovable, while residents in the audience whispered among themselves. From the back of the room, Maria watched with fascination as the adults around her struggled to respond to Marcus's reasonable proposal. She had learned more about small-town politics in the past week than in her entire 12 years of life. She was beginning to understand that helping people wasn't just a matter of having resources, it was about having the will to use them, and sometimes the courage to challenge systems that weren't working. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, the town's only Black council member and one of only 2 physicians in Cedar Falls, finally spoke up. I think Johnson's proposal deserves serious consideration. I see patients every day who can't afford their medications or delay necessary treatments because of cost. If there's a way to help them while building community connections, we'd be foolish not to explore it. Her support seemed to embolden others. Several residents stood to speak in favor of the proposal, sharing stories of their own struggles with medical costs or those of neighbors and family members. Marcus was surprised by how many people seemed ready to support the idea, and equally surprised by the resistance from some quarters.
The opposition came primarily from the North Side residents who worried about the fund being taken advantage of or becoming a magnet for people looking for handouts. Their objections were carefully worded to avoid sounding heartless, but their underlying message was clear. They feared that helping struggling families would somehow diminish their own security or status. As the meeting stretched past its usual 90-minute limit, Marcus realized he was witnessing something larger than a debate about healthcare funding.
He was seeing a community forced to confront its own values and priorities in real time. The comfortable fiction that Cedar Falls was one big, happy family was dissolving under the weight of honest discussion about inequality and mutual responsibility. The meeting ended with a promise to study the proposal and form a committee to examine the issues, which Marcus correctly interpreted as bureaucratic stalling. But something important had happened in that room. Conversations that had been whispered in private were now part of the public record. Problems that had been ignored were now acknowledged. Most importantly, people who had never spoken to each other were beginning to see each other as neighbors rather than strangers. That evening, Marcus returned home to find his answering machine blinking with 17 messages. Some were supportive, offering to volunteer or donate to the health fund. Others were hostile, accusing him of grandstanding or stirring up trouble where none existed. A few were threatening, though in vague terms that fell short of actionable intimidation. As he listened to the messages, Marcus felt the weight of what he had started. This was no longer just about helping one family with medicine costs. He had challenged the unspoken agreements that kept Cedar Falls' two communities separate and unequal. Some people were ready for that challenge. Others were prepared to fight to maintain the status quo. The last message was from Maria. Her young voice was excited but serious as she spoke into the machine. Mr. Marcus, my mom says to tell you thank you for being brave today. She's feeling better already, and she wants to know if you'd like to come for dinner this weekend.
She's going to make enchiladas. There was a pause, and then Maria added, also, I think you should know that Mrs. Appello
Henderson from Maple Street came by our house today. She said she was sorry for how she treated me before, and she wants to help with your health fund, she said. Watching you at the meeting made her ashamed of herself. Marcus smiled as he reset the answering machine. Change was happening faster than he had expected and in directions he hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Henderson's apology was just one example of how his public stand had forced people to examine their own behavior and choices. Some were finding themselves wanting to do better. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of his proposal spread beyond Cedar Falls to the county and state level. Local media would follow Patricia Wells's story, and Marcus would find himself thrust into a spotlight he had never sought. But tonight, he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. The deep satisfaction that comes from being part of something meaningful, something that mattered beyond his own comfort and security. He was no longer the hermit rancher who minded his own business. He was Marcus Johnson, community organizer, advocate for the overlooked, and inadvertent catalyst for social change. The transformation scared him a little, but it also felt like coming home to himself after years of exile. The Sunday dinner at the Gonzalez house became the talk of Cedar Falls before the enchiladas had even finished cooking.
Word spread that Giant Johnson would be dining in the south side of town, and by late afternoon, curious neighbors found reasons to walk past the small yellow house. Some lingered hopefully on the sidewalk, clearly wanting to catch a glimpse of the unlikely friendship that had formed between the massive rancher and the determined little girl who had changed his life.
Elena Gonzalez stood at her stove for the first time in months, her color improved and her energy returning thanks to the medication that was no longer a source of daily anxiety.
She had insisted on cooking despite Roberto's protests, claiming that making a meal for the man who had saved her life was the least she could do.
Maria helped by setting the table with their best dishes, mismatched plates inherited from various relatives, but polished until they gleamed. When Marcus arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers from his ranch and a box of groceries, the emotional weight of the moment overwhelmed everyone. Elena hugged him with tears streaming down her face, speaking rapid Spanish that needed no translation. Roberto gripped his hand with the fervor of a man who had watched his world nearly collapse and then seen it rebuilt by an unexpected savior.
But, you know, Elena said as they settled around the small dining room table, when Maria first told us about you, I was scared.
All those stories people tell about you being dangerous and angry. But, looking at you now, I see someone who understands what it means to protect family. The conversation that followed revealed sides of each family member that surprised Marcus. Roberto, who seemed quiet and reserved in public, was actually quite philosophical, talking about the immigrant experience and the challenge of building a life in a place where you always felt like an outsider. Elena, despite her illness, had a sharp wit and surprising knowledge about local politics, having served on the school board before her diagnosis. And Maria, whom Marcus had first seen as a determined but desperate child, revealed herself to be remarkably perceptive about adult motivations and community dynamics. "I've been thinking about your health fund," Maria said during dessert, her serious expression making her look older than her 12 years. "The problem isn't just that people don't have money for medicine. It's that people don't talk to each other across town. Mrs. Henderson told me she never knew anyone was struggling because she never went to the South Side, and people from our neighborhood never asked her for help because they were afraid of being judged." Her observation struck Marcus as profoundly insightful.
During the past week, as he had researched and developed his proposal, he had focused on the practical aspects of fund administration and resource allocation. But Maria had identified the deeper issue. Cedar Falls was really two separate communities that happened to share the same zip code.
"What if the health fund was just the beginning?" Marcus asked, the idea forming as he spoke. "What if we used it as a way to bring people together, to create connections that go beyond just emergency assistance?" Elena leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if every family that receives help from the fund is matched with a family that contributes to it? Not as charity, but as community building. People checking on each other, sharing resources, maybe even becoming friends." Roberto nodded slowly, like the way neighborhoods used to work, before everyone got so separated. The conversation continued for hours, ranging from specific strategies for the health fund to broader discussions about community building and social change. Marcus found himself sharing stories from his military service, describing how diverse groups of people could come together around common goals when leadership created the right structure and incentives. By the time he left that evening, carrying a container of leftover enchiladas that Elena had insisted he take, Marcus had a completely new vision for what they were trying to accomplish. The health fund would still address immediate medical needs, but it would also serve as a vehicle for rebuilding the social connections that had somehow been severed in Cedar Falls over the years. The next morning brought validation for their expanded vision in an unexpected form. Patricia Wells's article had been published in the Dallas Morning News, and the response was overwhelming. The newspaper's phones were ringing constantly with people from across Texas offering to donate money, volunteer time, or share their own stories of communities divided by invisible barriers. More importantly for Cedar Falls, the article had caught the attention of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a public health researcher at the University of Texas who specialized in rural healthcare access. She called Marcus personally to discuss his proposal and offer technical assistance. "What you're describing, Dr. Mitchell explained during their hour-long conversation, is exactly what we've been studying in communities across the rural South. You're not just addressing medical needs, you're tackling the social determinants of health. Isolation, lack of social capital, community fragmentation, these things affect people's well-being just as much as access to prescription drugs." She offered to help Marcus refine his proposal with evidence-based best practices from similar programs, and more surprisingly, she suggested that Cedar Falls could become a pilot site for research that might inform policy recommendations at the state and national level. "Communities like yours are laboratories for social change," she told him. "If you can prove that integrated approaches work in small towns, it could influence how we think about rural healthcare nationwide." Marcus felt simultaneously excited and overwhelmed by the implications. What had started as a simple desire to help one sick mother was evolving into something with much larger significance. The responsibility was daunting, but it also felt like the most important work he had ever done. The real test of their expanding vision came that Wednesday evening at the community center, where Marcus had organized the first public meeting about the health fund. He had expected perhaps 20 or 30 people to attend. Instead, nearly 200 residents packed the small auditorium, with more standing in the hallway outside. The crowd was remarkably diverse, economically, racially, and geographically. Marcus saw faces from both sides of town, people he recognized from his rare trips to local businesses, alongside neighbors he had never met. The energy in the room was electric, charged with the possibility of change, but also thick with the tension that comes when long-standing boundaries are challenged. Marcus began by sharing Elena Gonzalez's story, but he quickly moved to the broader issues that her situation had revealed. Using charts and data that Dr. Mitchell had helped him prepare, he showed how healthcare costs were affecting families throughout Cedar Falls, not just those living in obvious poverty.
This isn't about poor people needing help, Marcus explained. This is about middle-class families going bankrupt because someone gets cancer.
This is about elderly residents choosing between heating bills and prescription medications. This is about young parents avoiding doctor visits because they can't afford the copays.
The audience was completely silent as Marcus presented story after story of medical crises that had devastated local families. Many people were hearing these details for the first time, despite living just miles away from the affected families.
The isolation that Maria had identified was being quantified in real time. But Marcus's most powerful moment came when he shifted from problem identification to solution presentation.
Rather than simply asking for donations to a fund, he outlined a comprehensive community building program that would use healthcare needs as a starting point for deeper connections. Every family that contributes to the fund will be matched with another family in the community, he explained.
Not as charity, but as neighbors. The goal is for people to know each other's names, check on each other's well-being, and share resources and knowledge.
We're not just building a health fund. We're rebuilding our community. The response was immediate and overwhelming.
Hands shot up around the auditorium as people volunteered to serve on committees, organized fundraising events, or coordinate outreach efforts.
Mrs. Henderson stood to formally apologize for her initial treatment of Maria and pledged to lead the Northside recruitment effort. Dr. Chenstow
Morrison offered to provide medical expertise and connect the fund with existing healthcare resources. But the most powerful moment came when Roberto Gonzalez asked to speak.
The quiet man who rarely said more than a few words in public stood slowly, his voice trembling slightly as he addressed the crowd. 3 weeks ago, my daughter had to walk around town begging for help to save her mother's life, he said.
Not because we were lazy or irresponsible, but because our insurance company decided my wife's life wasn't worth $800. Maria was turned away from house after house by people who could have helped but chose not to.
The auditorium was absolutely silent.
I'm not angry about that anymore, Roberto continued, his voice growing stronger.
Because those rejections led my daughter to Mr. Johnson's door, and his kindness led all of us here tonight.
Sometimes we have to see how broken something is before we can fix it. He looked around the room, making eye contact with people from both sides of town.
My family will be the first to receive help from this fund, but we won't be the last. And when other families need help, we'll be among the first to give it. Because that's what neighbors do. They take care of each other. The standing ovation that followed Roberto's remarks lasted nearly 5 minutes.
Marcus watched from the front of the room as people who had probably never spoken to each other began introducing themselves, exchanging phone numbers, and making plans to volunteer together. The invisible line that had divided Cedar Falls for decades was beginning to blur.
By the end of the evening, they had collected over $12,000 in initial pledges, recruited 47 volunteers for various committees, and established partnerships with local businesses and medical providers. More importantly, they had created something that had been missing from Cedar Falls for longer than anyone could remember, a shared sense of purpose and possibility. As people filed out of the community center, many stopped to thank Marcus personally, but he found himself redirecting their gratitude toward Maria, who had started everything with her courage and determination, and toward each other, for choosing to respond with open hearts rather than closed minds.
The little girl who had cried on his porch just 2 weeks earlier was now helping to coordinate volunteer schedules and match families with donors. The sick mother who couldn't afford her medication was planning a fundraising dinner to support other families in crisis.
The isolated rancher who had spent 5 years avoiding community involvement was now at the center of the largest volunteer effort in Cedar Falls history. Change was happening faster than any of them had expected, and in ways that none of them had fully anticipated.
But as Marcus locked up the community center that night and drove home to his ranch, he felt certain that they were building something that would last, something that would make Cedar Falls a different kind of place for everyone who called it home. 6 months later, Cedar Falls looked like the same small Texas town it had always been, but anyone who lived there could feel the fundamental changes that had taken root like wildflowers after a long drought.
The Cedar Falls Community Health and Connection Fund had officially launched in February with a board of directors that included representatives from every neighborhood, profession, and demographic group in town. By summer, it had assisted over 50 families with medical expenses totaling more than $40,000.
But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was visible in the relationships that had formed between people who might never have spoken to each other before. Maria knocked on Marcus Johnson's door that scorching Tuesday afternoon.
Mrs. Henderson, who had once turned Maria away with harsh words about people who don't help themselves, was now Elena Gonzalez's closest friend and had learned to make passable enchiladas under Elena's patient tutelage. The unlikely friendship had begun when Mrs. Henderson volunteered to drive Elena to medical appointments, but it had deepened into something neither woman had expected, a genuine bond that transcended the economic and cultural differences that had once seemed insurmountable.
Ellen comes over every Thursday for coffee, Elena told a reporter from the Tyler Morning Telegraph who was writing a follow-up story about Cedar Falls' transformation. She's teaching me to knit, and I'm teaching her Spanish. My mother always said that friendship is the best medicine, and she was right. The friendship between Elena and Helen had become a model for the community connection program that was now the most popular aspect of the Health Fund.
Every family that received assistance was paired with a contributing family, but the relationships that formed went far beyond simple charity. People were sharing babysitting duties, organizing carpools, exchanging garden vegetables, and providing emotional support during difficult times.
Maria, now 13 and in 7th grade, had become something of a local celebrity. Her courage in knocking on doors and refusing to give up had inspired not just the Health Fund, but a broader youth engagement program.
She served on the fund's advisory board alongside adults, and her perspective on community issues was sought by everyone from the town council to the school board. Sometimes adults forget that kids see things differently, Maria explained to a group of visiting public health researchers. We notice when our friends don't have lunch money or when their parents look worried all the time. If you really want to help families, you have to listen to kids too. Her leadership had encouraged other young people to get involved. The high school now had an active community service club that worked with the Health Fund to identify families in need and organize support networks. Students from both sides of town collaborated on projects, forming friendships that their parents marveled at. Marcus Johnson had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all.
The man who had once avoided town council meetings now served as the volunteer coordinator for the Health Fund and had been appointed to the County Health Advisory Board. His ranch had become an unofficial community center, hosting barbecues, volunteer training sessions, and planning meetings.
I spent 5 years trying to mind my own business, Marcus reflected during a June board meeting. What I didn't understand is that in a small town, everyone's business is your business eventually.
You can either be part of the solution or part of the problem, but you can't really be neutral. His military experience had proven invaluable in organizing the complex logistics of the Health Fund. He had created systems for intake, evaluation, resource allocation, and follow-up that other communities were now copying. But more importantly, his willingness to stand up and take leadership had given permission for other quiet voices in the community to speak up. The Health Fund had evolved beyond its original mission in ways that surprised even its founders. What began as emergency assistance for prescription medications had expanded to include transportation to medical appointments, temporary childcare during hospital stays, home-cooked meals for families in crisis, and even basic home repairs that affected health and safety. Dr. Mitchell's research project had documented remarkable improvements in community health metrics that went far beyond the direct services provided by the fund. Emergency room visits for preventable conditions had dropped by 30%. Mental health indicators had improved across all age groups. Even school attendance and academic performance had shown measurable gains. What Cedar Falls has accomplished, Mitchell wrote in her preliminary report, demonstrates the powerful connection between social cohesion and public health. When people feel supported by their community, when they have relationships that transcend traditional boundaries, their overall well-being improves in measurable ways. The success had not come without challenges. There had been initial resistance from some quarters, particularly when the fund began assisting undocumented immigrants and families with complex social service needs.
A few longtime residents had complained that the program was attracting undesirable elements to the town.
But these voices had been overwhelmed by the enthusiasm of the majority. The fund's transparent governance structure and inclusive decision-making process had built trust across traditional dividing lines.
When conflicts arose, they were addressed through open dialogue rather than behind closed-door maneuvering. The most significant opposition had come from neighboring towns where some officials worried that Cedar Falls was becoming a magnet for welfare seekers. A few county commissioners had suggested that the Health Fund was encouraging dependence and undermining traditional values. These criticisms had only strengthened the resolve of Cedar Falls residents. At a heated county commission meeting in April, Roberto Gonzalez had delivered a speech that was later reprinted in newspapers across East Texas. When my wife was dying and my daughter was begging for help, traditional values meant turning away from neighbors in need, Roberto had said.
The new values we've learned in Cedar Falls mean taking care of each other.
If that's controversial, then I'm proud to be controversial.
The speech had gone viral on social media, bringing positive attention to Cedar Falls from across the country. Delegations from other small towns had visited to learn about the health fund model. The mayor had received inquiries from communities as far away as Maine and Oregon.
By midsummer, the transformation was complete enough that longtime residents sometimes had trouble recognizing their own town. The annual 4th of July celebration, which had traditionally been segregated by neighborhood with separate events for different communities, had become a unified festival that drew visitors from across the region.
The festival was held at Marcus's ranch, with food trucks representing the town's diverse population, live music from local bands, and activities that brought together families from every corner of Cedar Falls. Elena Gonzalez organized a cooking competition that featured recipes from Mexican, African American, German, and Vietnamese traditions, reflecting the cultural diversity that had always existed in Cedar Falls, but had rarely been celebrated.
"This is what America's supposed to look like," said Patricia Wells, the reporter whose original story had sparked national interest in Cedar Falls. She had returned to write a 6-month follow-up piece. People from different backgrounds coming together around shared values, taking care of each other, building something bigger than themselves. The most poignant moment of the celebration came when Maria was invited to speak to the crowd. Standing on a makeshift stage looking out at hundreds of faces that now represented a true community rather than separate enclaves, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. 6 months ago, I walked around this town crying because nobody would help my mom, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch.
I thought there was something wrong with our family, or something wrong with me. But there wasn't anything wrong with us. There was something wrong with how we treated each other. She paused, looking directly at Mrs. Dennis Henderson, who was sitting with the Gonzalez family in the front row. The best thing about the health fund isn't the money, Maria continued. It's that we learned how to be neighbors. We learned that taking care of each other doesn't make us weak, it makes us strong. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but it was the conversations that happened afterward that truly demonstrated how much had changed. People who had been strangers 6 months earlier were making plans for camping trips and birthday parties. Children who had attended separate schools were signing up for the same summer programs.
Adults who had shopped at different stores and attended different churches were forming book clubs and exercise groups that transcended old boundaries. As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Marcus found himself sitting on his porch with Maria and her parents, watching fireflies dance in the warm summer air.
The quiet satisfaction he felt was different from anything he had experienced during his years of isolation. This was the contentment that comes from being fully connected to community, from knowing that your life has purpose beyond personal comfort and security. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door? Maria asked, her voice drowsy but curious. Marcus considered the question seriously. Without Maria's courage, Elena might have died from lack of medication. The health fund would never have been created. The community connections that now seem so natural and necessary would never have formed. He himself would still be the hermit rancher, unknown and uninvolved, watching from the sidelines as neighbors struggled with problems he could have helped solve.
"I think about it all the time," he admitted. "But you know what?
I think if it hadn't been you, it would have been someone else eventually. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the crisis would have been different, but sooner or later, this community was going to remember how to take care of each other."
Elena shook her head gently. "Don't be so modest, Marcus. Change doesn't just happen by itself.
It takes people who are willing to stand up and do what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Roberto nodded in agreement. "My daughter saved her mother's life, but you saved our community. Both of those things took courage." As the Gonzalez family prepared to leave, Elena hugged Marcus with the warmth of someone who had found not just a benefactor but a true friend. "You know," she said with a smile, "next Sunday I'm making tamales.
You should come for dinner. I'll be there." Marcus promised, and as he watched them drive away, he realized that this was how real change happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic announcements, but through the accumulation of small acts of kindness, one invitation at a time, one relationship at a time, one choice to care about your neighbors at a time. The porch light cast a warm glow across the ranch as Marcus settled into his chair to enjoy the peaceful summer evening.
In the distance he could see the lights of Cedar Falls twinkling like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that was now connected to all the others in ways that made the whole community stronger. Maria's desperate knock on his door had changed everything, for her family, for the town, and for Marcus himself.
But as he sat there in the gathering darkness, listening to the cicadas and feeling the gentle breeze that carried the scent of hay and honeysuckle, Marcus knew that the real victory wasn't in any single transformation. It was in the proof that people could choose to be better than they had been before, that communities could heal old wounds and build new bonds, and that sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest acts of courage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families in need, new opportunities to strengthen the connections they had built.
But tonight, Cedar Falls was exactly what a community should be. A place where everyone belonged, where no one struggled alone, and where the simple act of caring for your neighbors had transformed strangers into family.